You will remove that dock by Friday, or I will have it torn down and bill you for the demolition. This is not a request. Those were the words that started the war. They were delivered by Brenda, our neighborhood's self-appointed queen, with a voice that could curdle milk from 100 paces. She stood on my lawn, a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield, her face a mask of smug certainty. The lake behind my house, the one my grandfather had dug with his own 2 hands 50 years ago, shimmered in the afternoon sun, completely oblivious to the storm brewing on its shore. Little did she know, I held the deed to the very ground she was standing on, and every single drop of water she claimed as her own. This wasn't just going to be a victory for me, it was going to be a complete and utter dismantling of her little empire. My story starts not with a bang, but with a quiet retreat. After my wife, Martha, passed away, the city felt too loud. The silence in our 4-bedroom colonial was a constant, screaming reminder of what I'd lost. Every room held a ghost. Every corner echoed with a memory. I needed a change, a place where the quiet was peaceful, not painful. The answer was my grandfather's old house, a modest but sturdy ranch-style home nestled on the edge of a small, private lake he'd created as the centerpiece for the very development we now lived in. I was a civil engineer by trade, a man who spent his life dealing with concrete, steel, and the unyielding laws of physics. I appreciated order, precision, and things that made sense. I wasn't looking for trouble. In fact, I was actively running from it. I just wanted to fish off my dock, watch the sun set over the water, and maybe, eventually, feel something like peace again. My grandfather had left me the house, and with it, a dusty old safe in the basement. Inside was a collection of his most important papers, including the original deeds to the property. I had glanced at them once, filed them away in my mind as sentimental heirlooms, and promptly forgotten the specifics. A mistake I wouldn't make again. The neighborhood, named Lakewood Estates, was idyllic on the surface. Manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and a palpable sense of suburban tranquility. But like a beautifully engineered bridge with a hidden stress fracture, it had a fundamental flaw. That flaw was Brenda, the president of our homeowners association. Brenda was a woman who seemed to be powered by a cocktail of entitlement and fury. She had lived in Lakewood for 20 years and wielded her HOA presidency like a royal scepter. She wasn't elected in any real sense, it was more of an acclamation by a weary populace who had long ago given up fighting her. Her rules were arbitrary, her enforcement draconian, and her presence was as welcome as a hornet in a phone booth. She patrolled the neighborhood in a golf cart she'd nicknamed the Enforcer, a laminated copy of the HOA bylaws always at her side. She saw violations where there were none, and conspiracies in every overgrown azalea bush. My first few months were blissfully under her radar. I kept to myself, painted the shutters, and did some minor repairs on the old wooden dock that jutted out into the lake. It was the same dock my grandfather had built, the one I'd learned to fish from as a boy. It was more than just wood and nails to me, it was a repository of memories, a connection to a happier time. The initial conflict, as they so often do, started over something laughably small. It was a letter, tucked into my mailbox, printed on offensively beige paper. It was a fine for $25. The violation. Unauthorized decorative statuary. The statue in question was a small, weathered garden gnome that Martha had bought me as a joke years ago. It sat half-hidden under a rose bush. I chuckled when I read it. This had to be a mistake. I walked over to Brenda's house, which was, of course, the largest on the block, with a 3-car garage and a lawn so perfect it looked like AstroTurf. I planned to have a reasonable, neighborly chat. "Brenda," I said, when she answered the door. "It's Frank, from number 12. I think there's been a bit of a mix-up with this fine." She looked down her nose at me, a practiced expression of disdain. "There is no mix-up, Mr. Miller. The bylaws clearly state all yard decorations must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee." "The committee? You mean you?" I asked, my attempt at friendliness already evaporating. "I'm the committee," she confirmed, puffing out her chest. "The gnome is tacky. It lowers property values. Pay the fine." She closed the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, stunned. It wasn't about the $25. It was the sheer, unadulterated arrogance. I went home, wrote a check, and left the gnome where he was. A small act of defiance. This, I would soon learn, was like waving a red flag at a very, very angry bull. The gnome incident opened the floodgates. A week later, I got a fine for my garbage cans being visible from the street for 2 hours after the designated pickup time. Then another for the paint color of my front door, which had been the same color for 30 years. I was being targeted, systematically and pettily. I tried to reason with her at first. I attended an HOA meeting, a depressing affair held in her garage where she lectured a handful of defeated-looking residents for an hour. I attempted to bring up my concerns, but she shut me down immediately. "We are not here to debate the rules, Mr. Miller. We are here to enforce them," she had announced to the room. "Compliance is not optional." I felt the eyes of my neighbors on me. They were a mix of pity and fear. They knew she was a tyrant, but they had families and jobs and had chosen the path of least resistance. They paid her ridiculous fines and jumped when she said jump, all for a quiet life. I understood, but I wasn't built that way. An engineer solves problems. And Brenda was rapidly becoming a very big problem. The real escalation began when she set her sights on the lake. My lake. She sent out a community-wide email, a rambling manifesto about preserving the aesthetic integrity and exclusive nature of our community's primary asset. The email outlined a new set of rules for the lake. There would be a fee for lake access, a schedule for when residents could use it, and a strict prohibition on any modifications to the shoreline. The crown jewel of this new policy was the declaration that all docks were now considered common property under the management of the HOA. That's when she showed up on my lawn, clipboard in hand, and delivered her ultimatum about my grandfather's dock. "This dock is not registered with the HOA," she stated, her voice sharp. "It's an unauthorized structure on community property." I just looked at her. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. "Brenda," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice even. "This dock has been here since before the HOA existed. It's part of my property." She gave a short, barking laugh. "Oh, no. You're mistaken. The HOA covenants, which you agreed to when you moved in, clearly state that all common areas, including the lake and its shoreline, are under HOA control." "The lake isn't a common area," I said. "Of course it is," she snapped, her face turning a blotchy red. "It's the centerpiece of Lakewood Estates. Do you think you just get your own private lake? The entitlement." The irony was so thick I could have paved a road with it. I knew I had to be careful. I couldn't just blurt out that I owned the whole thing. A claim like that needed to be backed up with unassailable proof. A direct confrontation now would just be my word against hers, and she controlled the board, the narrative, and the neighborhood's social media page. I needed a strategy. I needed to let her dig her own grave. So, I played dumb. "I'll have to look at my paperwork, Brenda." I was under a different impression. Her eyes narrowed. She didn't like that I wasn't immediately capitulating. "The impression you should have is that I am in charge here. You have until Friday. 5 o'clock. After that, a demolition crew will be here, and you will be responsible for the cost, plus a $1,000 fine for noncompliance." She turned on her heel and marched back to her golf cart, leaving me standing there with the quiet fury of a patient man pushed too far. The war had officially been declared. She had just tried to seize my property, my history. She had threatened to tear down the last physical connection I had to my grandfather, to my childhood. She had made a critical error. She had turned a minor squabble into a full-blown assault on my legacy. And I, a man who designed systems to withstand immense pressure, was about to design a system to ensure her complete and total collapse. That night, I didn't sleep. I went down to the dusty basement, to the old, heavy safe that had sat untouched for years. The combination was my grandfather's birthday. The heavy door groaned open, releasing the smell of old paper and history. There, in a leather-bound folder, was a document titled, Deed of Title. I pulled it out, my hands trembling slightly. I spread it out on the workbench under the single bare bulb. The language was dense, full of legal jargon from a bygone era, but the survey map attached was crystal clear. It showed the entire parcel of land my grandfather had purchased in 1968. And there, outlined in a bold, unwavering line, was my lot, Lot 12. Uniquely, the property line for Lot 12 didn't stop at the water's edge. It extended out, encompassing the entire lake bed, right up to the retaining walls on the other side. A small, handwritten note from my grandfather was clipped to the page. "Frankie," it read, "never sell the water. A man's got to have a place to fish in peace. They can have the dirt around it, but the heart of it is yours." A slow smile spread across my face. Brenda thought she was the queen, ruling over her community lake. In reality, she was nothing more than a tenant, and she was about to be served an eviction notice from a landlord she never knew she had. The game was on. My first step was to play for time and gather intelligence. The next morning, I sent Brenda a certified letter. It was polite, formal, and designed to do one thing: make her believe I was taking her threat seriously while legally covering my bases. I stated that I was reviewing the property documents with my legal counsel and requested a 30-day stay on any action regarding the dock, pending this review. I knew she would see it as a sign of weakness, an admission that I was scrambling for a defense. That was exactly what I wanted. An overconfident opponent is a sloppy opponent. Next, I went to the county records office. I spent the entire day poring over microfiche, pulling original subdivision plats and the founding documents for the Lakewood Estates HOA. I'm an engineer, details are my currency. I cross-referenced everything with the deed in my safe. The picture that emerged was fascinating. My grandfather, a shrewd man, had set up the HOA himself when he developed the land. The original bylaws were simple, focused on maintaining roads and basic aesthetics. Critically, the section defining common areas was vague. It listed parks and entrance signs, but it never explicitly mentioned the lake. Brenda was operating on a version of the bylaws that had been amended a dozen times over the years, each amendment adding another layer of her tyrannical control. But the original charter, the document that legally established the HOA, was silent on the lake's ownership. Her entire claim was built on a foundation of assumptions, a house of cards I was about to blow over. While I was digging through paperwork, Brenda was escalating. The community Facebook group, which she moderated with an iron fist, lit up with posts about unneighborly behavior and disregard for community rules. She never used my name, but the references to the property on the North Shore were obvious. Posts appeared about my dilapidated dock being an eyesore and a safety hazard. Comments from her loyal sycophants followed, calling for immediate action. It was a classic public shaming campaign, designed to isolate me and turn the community against me. It was petty, it was vicious, and it was playing right into my hands. I took screenshots of everything. Documentation is the ammunition in a war like this. My ally emerged from an unexpected place. George, a retired attorney who lived 3 doors down, had seen the posts online. He was a quiet man I'd only ever exchanged pleasantries with while mowing our lawns. He showed up at my door one evening, a concerned look on his face. "Frank," he said, skipping the small talk. "I saw what Brenda's posting. You need to be careful. She's a barracuda." I invited him in and, over a couple of beers, I laid it all out. I showed him my grandfather's deed, the original plats, the county records. His eyes, accustomed to decades of reading fine print, widened as he scanned the documents. "My God," he breathed, looking up from the survey map. "You don't just own the dock. You own the whole damn thing. The water, the fish, the mud at the bottom. It's all yours." "That's what I thought," I said. "But how do I fight her? She controls the HOA. She'll just ignore this." George leaned back, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. The retired lawyer was gone, replaced by the shark he used to be. "Oh, she'll ignore it at first. That's the point. We don't just want to win, Frank. We want to let her run so far out on this limb that the only thing she can do is fall. We let her break the law. We document it. And then we bring the whole rotten structure down on her head." His words were a bomb. I finally had a partner, someone who understood the game. We spent the next 2 weeks formulating a plan. It was a beautiful thing, a multi-phased strategy that would have made a military general proud. It was a plan built on Brenda's own arrogance. The harassment continued to escalate. I received a certified letter from the HOA's lawyer, a cut-rate firm that probably gave Brenda a discount, reiterating her demands and dismissing my request for a stay. They gave me a new deadline, 48 hours. The fines were piling up. 1 for unmowed grass within 10 feet of the shoreline, on my property. Another for my fishing boat being tied to the dock in a way that was aesthetically displeasing. My dog, a gentle old golden retriever named Buster, was declared a nuisance for barking at the geese. This was the turning point for me. Threatening my property was one thing. Trying to tear down my grandfather's dock was another. But coming after my dog, that crossed a line. Martha had given me Buster as a puppy right after my diagnosis, a furry, four-legged reason to get out of bed in the morning. He was all I had left of her. The quiet, methodical engineer in me receded, replaced by something colder, harder. The goal was no longer just to win. The goal was to utterly and completely crush her. My investigation deepened. I started looking into the HOA's finances. The documents were supposed to be available to all homeowners, but Brenda guarded them like state secrets. I had to file a formal request, which she ignored for 2 weeks before finally providing a heavily redacted, confusing summary. It was useless, but her reluctance was telling. It was like a flashing red light. People who have nothing to hide don't hide things. I knew I needed more than just a property deed. I needed to understand Brenda's vulnerabilities. What was her weakness? It was always power and money. I suspected the two were linked. I started talking to my other neighbors, quietly, discreetly. I learned about the special assessments Brenda would levy for community improvement projects that never seemed to materialize. I heard stories of landscaping contracts awarded to a company owned by her brother-in-law. The picture was getting clearer. This wasn't just a power trip, it was a grift. The most critical discovery came from a simple public records search. I looked up the permits for all the recent HOA projects, the new entrance gate, the repaving of the community tennis court. Then I looked up the business license for the contractor who did the work, Prestige Home Solutions. The address listed for the business was Brenda's own house. She wasn't just giving contracts to a family member, she was giving them to a shell company she controlled herself. She was embezzling, using the HOA as her personal piggy bank. It was brazen, it was arrogant, and it was a felony. This was the weakness I had been looking for. This was the kill shot. My property dispute was now the least of her problems. She just didn't know it yet. With George's help, I had everything I needed. The deed proved I owned the lake. The county records proved the HOA had no claim to it. The screenshots proved her campaign of harassment. And the business records proved she was a crook. Now, all I had to do was set the trap. And I knew exactly what the bait would be. The plan was simple, elegant, and designed to prey on Brenda's most potent weaknesses, her ego and her uncontrollable rage. George called it Operation Gazebo. First, I hired a professional land surveyor. It was an expense, but a necessary one. I needed an official, legally binding survey that staked out the exact property lines as defined by my grandfather's deed. I needed something irrefutable, stamped and signed by a licensed third party, that I could present in court if necessary. When the surveyor came out, his presence in the neighborhood caused a minor stir. Brenda watched from her window, her silhouette a rigid shape of suspicion. The surveyor and his team spent a full day driving stakes, using GPS equipment, and marking the boundaries with bright orange flags. The result was a beautiful, legally certified map that showed, in no uncertain terms, that my property line extended 50 feet past the shoreline of every other house, encompassing the entire lake. The orange flags marching into the water were a beautiful sight. Next, I took a trip to the hardware store. I bought lumber, concrete, and all the materials needed to build a small, handsome gazebo. It wouldn't be large, but it would be well built and elegant. And I was going to build it right at the end of my dock, sitting directly over the water she so firmly believed she controlled. It was a declaration. It was a dare. I also invested in some technology. I installed several high-definition, motion-activated security cameras around my property. 2 were focused on the dock and the new construction site. 1 was pointed at my front yard, and another covered the side of my house where Brenda had previously claimed my trash cans were a nuisance. They were small, discreet, and recorded crystal-clear audio and video to a cloud server. Every interaction, every trespass, every word would be captured. Before I hammered the first nail, George and I drafted a series of legal documents. We prepared a formal notice of trespass to be served to Brenda and any contractor she hired. We prepared a cease and desist letter regarding her harassment and defamation on the community Facebook page. We also put together a comprehensive package of all our evidence, the deed, the survey, the financial records of her shell company. We had it ready to go, a loaded weapon waiting for the right moment to be fired. Then, construction began. I started on a Saturday morning. The sound of my circular saw cutting through fresh pine was, I imagined, a direct assault on Brenda's sense of order. I worked slowly, methodically, enjoying the process. I was an engineer, after all. Building things was in my blood. This gazebo was more than just a structure, it was a carefully engineered legal trap. It took less than an hour for her to appear. Her golf cart, the enforcer, screeched to a halt at the edge of my lawn. She didn't get out. She just sat there, her arms crossed, glaring. The camera on my front porch was recording her every move. I ignored her. I just kept measuring, cutting, and hammering. Her presence was a buzzing in the air, like static before a lightning strike. After about 30 minutes of her silent, menacing watch, she finally yelled. "Mr. Miller. What do you think you are doing?" I stopped hammering and turned to face her, a pleasant smile on my face. "Good morning, Brenda. I'm building a gazebo." "Lovely day for it, isn't it?" "You most certainly are not," she shrieked, her voice echoing across the placid water. "That is unauthorized construction on HOA common property. I have already told you about that, Doc." "As I told you, Brenda, I'm quite certain this is my property," I said calmly, gesturing to the survey flags. I had it professionally confirmed. She squinted, her eyes finally noticing the bright orange markers. A flicker of something, confusion, maybe even a tiny spark of fear, crossed her face before it was replaced by her usual mask of rage. "Those mean nothing," she spat. "You cannot just put stakes in the ground and claim community land. I am ordering you to stop construction immediately." "I'm afraid I can't do that," I said, picking up my hammer. "Now if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." I turned my back on her and went back to my project. I could feel her fury radiating across the lawn. I heard the whine of her golf cart's electric motor as she sped away. The bait was in the water. Now, I just had to wait for the shark to bite. The bite came 2 days later. It was a Tuesday morning. I received an email from Brenda, CCing the entire HOA mailing list. It was a masterpiece of self-righteous indignation. It accused me of brazenly violating community covenants, of aggressive and illegal seizure of common property, and of creating a dangerous and unpermitted structure. The email concluded with a bold declaration: since Mr. Miller has refused to comply with multiple notices, the HOA has no choice but to hire a contractor to remove the illegal dock and the unpermitted structure at his expense. This action will take place on Thursday at 9 a.m. Bingo. She had taken the bait. She had announced, in writing, to the entire community, her intention to come onto my property and destroy my belongings. It was better than I could have hoped for. George was ecstatic when I showed him the email. "She's a fool," he chuckled. "She just handed us a signed confession. She's documented her own intent to commit criminal trespass and destruction of property." We spent the next day making our final preparations. George contacted the local sheriff's department. He didn't file a formal complaint yet, but he spoke to a sergeant he knew, explaining the situation and the potential for a confrontation. He informed them that we had a legitimate property dispute, that we had a certified survey, and that the other party had threatened to take matters into her own hands. He requested that a deputy be present on Thursday morning to keep the peace. The sergeant, after hearing the details, readily agreed. I spent the day putting the finishing touches on the gazebo. It looked good. The roof was on, the railings were up. It was a peaceful little spot, a perfect place to watch the sunset. It was a shame it had to be a battleground. On Thursday morning, a cool breeze was blowing across the lake. The air was thick with anticipation. George arrived at 8:30 a.m., dressed in a sharp suit, carrying a leather briefcase. He looked less like a retired neighbor and more like the high-powered litigator he once was. At 8:45, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up quietly and parked down the street. The deputy, a tall, professional-looking woman, got out and spoke with George, who showed her our paperwork. She nodded, her expression neutral, and took up a discreet position where she could see my entire backyard. At 9 a.m., right on schedule, the circus arrived. A large flatbed truck from a company called Dave's Demolition rumbled down the street, followed closely by Brenda in her golf cart. She was in her element, leading her troops into battle. A small crowd of curious neighbors had gathered at a safe distance, drawn by the prospect of drama. Brenda parked her cart and marched onto my lawn, a triumphant smirk on her face. Two burly-looking men from the demolition company got out of the truck and started unloading equipment, chainsaws, crowbars, and heavy-duty winches. I walked out to meet her, George at my side. My heart was pounding, but my face was calm. All my cameras were rolling. "Brenda," I said, my voice even. "This is your last chance. Turn your men around and leave my property." She laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Your property? You are delusional. I am here to enforce the community bylaws you chose to ignore. You've brought this on yourself." "Dave," she yelled to one of the workers, "start with the gazebo. I want it in pieces." As the man took a step forward, George stepped in front of him. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight of authority. "And who are you?" Brenda sneered. "I am this man's legal counsel," George said, opening his briefcase. "And this," he said, handing a document to the demolition worker, "is a notice of trespass. If you or your employee set one foot on that dock, you will be charged with criminal trespass and destruction of private property. My client owns this land, this dock, and the lake it sits on. We have a certified survey and the original deed to prove it." He then turned and handed a thick envelope to Brenda. "And this is for you. It's a cease and desist order for your continued harassment and defamation. It also informs you that you are being held personally liable for any damages incurred today." Brenda stared at the papers in her hand as if they were written in a foreign language. Her face went from smug to confused to furious in the space of a few seconds. "This is ridiculous. A trick," she sputtered. "You have no authority here. This is HOA property. I am the president." "Actually," a new voice said. We all turned. The sheriff's deputy was walking towards us, her expression now firm. "Actually, ma'am, for now, this is a civil dispute. And until it's sorted out, nobody is tearing anything down." Brenda's jaw dropped. She looked at the deputy, then back at me, her mind clearly unable to process this turn of events. Her authority was being challenged, not by me, but by a uniformed officer of the law. "This is my jurisdiction," she insisted, her voice rising to a shrill peak. "I run this neighborhood. You can't tell me what to do." The deputy just raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, I can and I am. This is private property, and the owner has asked you to leave. Your contractors will not be performing any work here today. Now, I suggest you disperse before this escalates into a criminal matter." The demolition workers, seeing the uniform and hearing the words, "criminal matter," immediately started packing up their tools. They wanted no part of this. "Sorry, lady," one of them muttered to Brenda. "We don't get paid enough for this." They got in their truck and drove away. Brenda was left standing there, abandoned by her hired muscle, holding legal papers she didn't understand, and being stared down by a sheriff's deputy. The neighbors were watching, whispering amongst themselves. Her public display of power had turned into a public humiliation. Her face was a storm of conflicting emotions. The smirk was long gone, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She looked at me, her eyes burning with a hatred that was terrifying in its intensity. "You will regret this," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I will ruin you. I will bury you." She then turned, stomped back to her golf cart, and sped off, leaving a silence broken only by the chirping of birds and the quiet murmur of the watching neighbors. I had won the battle, but her parting threat hung in the air. This wasn't over. I had publicly humiliated her and stripped away her perceived authority. A person like Brenda doesn't just accept defeat. They double down. They get nastier. I knew her retaliation would be vicious and personal. And I was ready for it. The trap had been sprung, but the monster was only wounded, not slain. The final, ugliest part of the war was about to begin. The fallout from the failed demolition was immediate. Brenda's public humiliation morphed into a private, obsessive vendetta. She was cornered, and like any cornered animal, she became infinitely more dangerous. The flimsy pretense of enforcing bylaws was gone, replaced by a raw, personal desire to destroy me. Her first move was to try and turn my victory into a weapon against me. She launched a smear campaign that made her previous efforts on Facebook look like child's play. She sent out another mass email, this time filled with outright lies. She accused me of forging documents, of hiring an intimidating lawyer to threaten her, and of calling the police to bully a female community leader. She painted herself as the victim, a dedicated volunteer just trying to protect the neighborhood from a dangerous and unstable newcomer. But her most vicious attack was yet to come. She started spreading a rumor that I was dumping chemicals into the lake. It began as whispers between her loyalists, then appeared as anonymous posts on the community page. "Has anyone noticed the water looking cloudy near the north shore?" one post read. Another claimed to have seen me pouring something from an unmarked canister off my dock late at night. It was a calculated, insidious lie, designed to turn me from a grumpy rule breaker into a public menace. It was also incredibly dangerous. An accusation like that could bring in the Environmental Protection Agency, lead to massive fines, and permanently stain my reputation. She took it a step further. One morning, I woke up to find a dozen dead fish floating near my dock. They had been placed there, a piece of grotesque theater for the neighbors to see. Later that day, an official from the County Environmental Services Department showed up at my door, responding to an anonymous tip. Brenda had planted evidence and then called the authorities on me. Luckily, my cameras saved me. I had footage of a hooded figure walking onto my dock in the middle of the night and dumping a bucket of dead fish into the water. The figure was careful, but at one point, they turned just enough for the camera to get a clear shot of their face. It was Brenda's husband, a man who followed her around like a whipped dog. I showed the footage to the county official. His expression went from stern to apologetic. He took a copy of the video as evidence and assured me the complaint would be dismissed. He also mentioned that filing a false report with his department was a serious offense. Brenda's attempt to frame me had not only failed, it had created another piece of evidence of her criminal behavior. This was the final escalation I needed. Her actions had now crossed firmly into felony territory, filing a false report and conspiring to plant evidence. It was time to bring in the final piece of the puzzle. It was time to expose the money. My quiet inquiries into the HOA's finances had hit a wall. Brenda controlled the books, and she wasn't letting anyone see them. But I had a hunch that not everyone on her board was a willing co-conspirator. There was one man, Arthur, the HOA treasurer. He was a quiet, mousy accountant who seemed terrified of Brenda. I had seen him at meetings, nervously fidgeting while she held court. He struck me as a man who had been bullied into compliance, not a true believer. He was my potential whistleblower. Reaching out to him was a risk. If he was loyal to her, he would report back immediately, and I would lose my element of surprise. But watching him, I sensed a deep well of resentment behind his fearful exterior. I decided to take the chance. I found his email address in the community directory and sent him a carefully worded message. I didn't make any accusations. I simply stated that as a homeowner, I was concerned about some financial discrepancies I had noticed in the public summaries and that I had uncovered information about a potential conflict of interest regarding the HOA's primary contractor, Prestige Home Solutions. I attached the public business license record showing the company was registered to Brenda's address. I finished by saying that if he had any concerns as the treasurer, I would be happy to speak with him in complete confidence. I sent the email and waited. For 2 days, there was nothing. I thought I had made a mistake. Then, late on the third night, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Is this Frank Miller?" a shaky voice asked. "It is." "Who is this?" "This is Arthur." "The HOA treasurer," he whispered. "We can't talk on the phone. Can you meet me?" We met the next morning at a coffee shop in the next town over. Arthur was a nervous wreck. He kept looking over his shoulder as if Brenda might materialize out of the steam from the cappuccino machine. "She's a monster," he stammered after I bought him a coffee. "I've wanted to say something for years, but I was afraid. She threatened me. Said she'd ruin my accounting practice, tell my clients I was a fraud." "What has she been doing, Arthur?" I asked gently. What he told me was worse than I had imagined. For years, Brenda had been systematically looting the HOA. the shell company was just the beginning. She was using the HOA debit card for personal expenses, groceries, vacations, designer clothes. She was falsifying invoices, inflating costs for routine maintenance, and pocketing the difference. The special assessments were slush funds for her personal projects. The neighborhood's money, our money, was funding her lavish lifestyle. She made me cook the books, Arthur confessed, his voice cracking. She'd stand over my shoulder while I did the quarterly reports, telling me what numbers to change. I have the real records, though. I kept a separate set of books on a flash drive. I was so scared, but I knew one day she'd get caught. It was the final, undeniable proof. The smoking gun. Arthur, trembling, slid a small flash drive across the table. It's all on there, he said. The real bank statements, the fake invoices, emails from her directing me to falsify the records. Everything. I looked at the small piece of plastic in my hand. It was the key to ending Brenda's reign of terror. Arthur, I said, my voice filled with a gravity I rarely felt. You've done the right thing. And I promise you, I will make sure you are protected. With the flash drive in my possession, all the pieces were in place. I had the deed to the lake, proving her trespass. I had the video of her husband planting evidence, proving her conspiracy. And now, I had a flash drive full of financial records proving years of embezzlement and fraud. I immediately went to George's house. When I laid out the new evidence, his eyes lit up. This is it, Frank. This isn't an HOA dispute anymore. This is a criminal enterprise. It's time to stop playing defense. It's time to call in the big guns. George made a call, not to the local sheriff this time, but to a contact he had in the state's economic crimes unit. He laid out the case in precise, legal terms, a pattern of embezzlement exceeding hundreds of thousands of dollars over several years, supported by whistleblower testimony and documentary evidence. The state was very, very interested. Meanwhile, Brenda, oblivious to the storm about to break over her head, was planning her own final showdown. She called a special, emergency community meeting. The agenda was singular, a vote to forcibly remove me from the HOA and place a lien on my house for all the fines and damages I had supposedly caused. She was going for the kill, trying to use the full power of the HOA to expel me from my home. The meeting was to be held in the community clubhouse in 3 days. The notice she sent out was filled with her usual venomous rhetoric, calling me a cancer on the community that needed to be excised. It was perfect. She was gathering the entire community in one place to witness her ultimate triumph. Instead, they were about to witness her spectacular downfall. George and I coordinated with the state investigators. They agreed to let the meeting begin. They wanted to see what she would say, to let her incriminate herself one last time in front of the whole neighborhood before they made their move. The stage was set for the final act. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. It felt less like an HOA meeting and more like a public trial. The air was thick with tension and gossip. I saw neighbors who had never attended a meeting before, drawn by the promise of a public execution. My execution. Brenda sat at a long table at the front of the room, flanked by her 2 loyal, bobble-headed board members. She looked radiant, dressed in a power suit, a shark sensing blood in the water. When I walked in with George, a hush fell over the room. Every eye was on me. I saw a mix of expressions, pity, hostility, and a few glimmers of support from people like George and a handful of others I'd spoken to. I ignored them all, my focus entirely on Brenda. I took a seat in the front row. She began the meeting without preamble, her voice ringing with false solemnity. "We are gathered here tonight to address a grave threat to our community," she announced. "Frank Miller has repeatedly and flagrantly violated our covenants. He has illegally seized community property, harassed your board president, and shown a complete disregard for the rules that protect our property values and our way of life." She went on for 20 minutes, laying out her distorted version of events. She painted me as an unhinged aggressor and herself as the long-suffering guardian of the neighborhood. She presented a slideshow with pictures of my unauthorized gnome, my aesthetically displeasing boat, and the dangerous gazebo. It was a masterclass in propaganda, and some people were buying it. I could hear murmurs of agreement around the room. Finally, she got to the main event. "Therefore, The board proposes a vote to expel Frank Miller from the Lakewood Estates Homeowners Association, to place a lien on his property for the sum of $50,000 in fines and legal fees, and to authorize the board to take any and all legal action necessary to reclaim the common property he has stolen. She looked directly at me, a triumphant sneer on her face. Does anyone have anything to say before we vote? This was my cue. I stood up slowly. George stood with me. I do, I said, my voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the silent room. You are out of order, Mr. Miller. Brenda snapped. Actually, Madam President, George interjected, stepping forward. My client has every right to speak. And I suggest everyone in this room listen very carefully to what he has to say. It concerns all of you. I walked to the front of the room, carrying a projector and a laptop. I set it up on a small table, my movements deliberate and unhurried. Brenda watched me, her confident smirk beginning to falter, replaced by a look of confusion. Brenda, you've made a lot of claims tonight, I began, turning to face the audience. You've talked a lot about community property, so I'd like to start by clearing up exactly who owns what around here. I projected the first image onto the screen behind Brenda. It was the certified survey map, with my property lines highlighted in bright red, clearly encompassing the entire lake. Gasps rippled through the crowd. This is a certified land survey, completed 2 weeks ago, I explained. And this, I clicked to the next slide, which showed a high-resolution scan of my grandfather's original deed, is the legal deed for my property, Lot 12, filed with the county in 1968. As you can see, I don't just own my dock. I own the entire lake. The water, the lake bed, everything. For the last 20 years, all of you have been swimming, fishing, and boating on my private property. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Brenda jumped to her feet. That's a forgery. It's fake. The lake is a common area. Is it? I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. I clicked to the next slide, the HOA's founding charter from 1970. This is the legal document that created our HOA. I'd invite you to find the part where it gives the HOA ownership or control of the lake. I'll save you the trouble. It doesn't exist. Your entire claim to the lake is a fantasy you invented. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with panic. She was losing control of the room. I kept going, my presentation moving from the property dispute to her personal campaign against me. I showed the screenshots of her defamatory Facebook posts. I played the audio from my security camera of her screaming threats at me on my lawn. Then, I played the footage of her husband dumping the dead fish by my dock. The room fell into a dead, stunned silence. People turned to stare at Brenda's husband, who looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Brenda didn't just harass me, I said, my voice hard as steel. She conspired to frame me for a crime, and then filed a false report with the county. But the question is, why? Why go to such extreme, illegal lengths over a dock? I paused for dramatic effect, letting the question hang in the air. Because this was never about the bylaws. It was about money. Your money. I clicked to the final part of my presentation. A spreadsheet appeared on the screen, simple and devastating. It had 2 columns. One was labeled, HOA official spending, the other was labeled, actual spending. For years, I said, Brenda has been using this HOA as her personal ATM. She created a shell company to award herself no-bid contracts at inflated prices. She used your dues to pay for her vacations, her car payments, her shopping sprees. Lies. These are all lies. Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking with desperation. Is it a lie, Arthur? I asked, turning my gaze to the treasurer, who was sitting in the back, looking terrified. Why don't you tell your neighbors the truth? Every head in the room swiveled to look at the timid little accountant. Arthur stood up, trembling, clutching a flash drive in his hand, a copy of the one he'd given me. It's true, he said, his voice barely a whisper, but it carried in the silent room. It's all true. She made me falsify the books. I have the real records right here. That's when the back doors of the clubhouse opened. 2 men and a woman in sober business suits walked in. They were flanked by 2 uniformed state police officers. Brenda, the lead investigator said, his voice calm and professional. I'm Agent Harris with the State Economic Crimes Unit. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Brenda's world collapsed in that single moment. The color drained from her face. Her body seemed to shrink. She looked around the room at the faces of her neighbors, faces that now held not fear or respect, but contempt and disgust. Her empire of petty tyranny had crumbled to dust in the space of 10 minutes. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Then, her composure finally shattered completely. She lunged towards me, her face contorted in a mask of pure, primal rage. You did this, she screamed, her hands clawed as if to scratch my eyes out. The state troopers intercepted her easily, restraining her as she thrashed and shrieked. It was an ugly, pathetic end to her reign. As they cuffed her and led her out of the clubhouse, she twisted her head back to look at me one last time. This isn't over, she howled, a final, impotent threat from a queen who had been dethroned. I'll get you for this. Then she was gone. The room was silent for a long moment, and then, it was as if a spell had been broken. People started talking, buzzing, looking at each other in disbelief. Several neighbors came up to me, shaking my hand, apologizing for not speaking up sooner. The community, so long held captive by fear, was finally free. My quiet war was over. I had won. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Brenda's downfall was total. Faced with the mountain of evidence Arthur provided, she and her husband both took plea deals. She was sentenced to 5 years in state prison for embezzlement and fraud. Her husband got probation for his role in the fish planting incident. They were forced to pay back every cent she had stolen from the HOA, a sum that amounted to nearly $300,000. The court-ordered restitution left them financially ruined. They had to sell their oversized house to cover the costs, and the last I heard, Brenda's husband had moved to another state to live with his sister, a broken and humiliated man. Her name became a cautionary tale in the neighborhood, a synonym for arrogance and corruption. The community itself began to heal. With Brenda gone, the atmosphere changed almost overnight. The fear and suspicion that had permeated Lakewood Estates evaporated, replaced by a renewed sense of neighborliness. An interim board was established, with George reluctantly agreeing to serve as a temporary advisor. They immediately went to work, poring over the bylaws. They systematically dismantled Brenda's labyrinth of petty rules, reverting to my grandfather's original, simpler charter. The focus shifted from punitive enforcement to actual community building. People started talking to each other again. There were neighborhood barbecues, a 4th of July parade for the kids. It started to feel like the kind of place my grandfather had envisioned all those years ago. As for the lake, my lake, I had to make a decision. I could have put up a fence, posted "No trespassing" signs, and kept it all to myself. After everything I had been through, a part of me was tempted. But that wasn't what my grandfather would have wanted. His note said a man needed a place to fish in peace, but he never said he had to fish alone. So, I worked with George to create a simple legal structure called the Lakewood Lake Trust. I retained ownership of the lake bed, but I granted a permanent access easement to every homeowner in the original development. The trust laid out a few common-sense rules: no gas motors, carry out your own trash, respect your neighbors, and was funded by a tiny, voluntary annual donation to cover things like weed control and stocking the lake with fish. I had protected my legacy and my property rights, but I had also shared my good fortune. The lake once again became the heart of the community, not a source of conflict. I finally found the peace I had been looking for when I first moved back. I spent my mornings on the new gazebo, coffee in hand, watching the mist rise off the water. Buster would lie at my feet, his old tail thumping a steady rhythm on the wooden planks. Neighbors would wave as they took their kayaks out for a morning paddle. There was no more fear, no more petty tyranny, just the quiet hum of a community at peace. Looking back, I never wanted to be a hero or a giant slayer. I was just a man who wanted to be left alone, a man who was pushed too far. Brenda's greed and arrogance were the weapons of her own destruction. I just provided the stage for her to use them. It's a strange thing, how the fight for something as simple as a place to fish in peace can lead you down such a complicated path. But in the end, standing on my grandfather's dock, in the quiet of a summer evening, I knew it had all been worth it. I had defended my home, liberated my neighbors, and honored the memory of the men who told me to never, ever sell the water. Justice, I learned, is a lot like civil engineering. You have to lay a solid foundation of truth, build a framework of evidence, and then patiently wait for the faulty structure across the way to collapse under the weight of its own corruption. And the view after the collapse is pretty spectacular.